Welcome everybody to Week in Review. This is our first episode for this new year. And I want to talk to you from really current events and from the scripture and bring you the truth. But first of all, what I'd like to do is tell you the title. Today is very special. We're not just going to look ahead. It's going to be more looking back. And I want to talk to you, and I've got notes because I want to be very accurate, and I hope this will help you. I want to talk about the January 6th so-called insurrection. I want to give you the facts, the lies, yes, the lies, and all you need to know. Now, Franklin Graham said concerning the day, what was the reason for it? He said it was the swamp, the corruption that is in D.C. And there is lots of corruption. Years ago, I heard a story about two fellas. They were both politicians. They were very corrupt and evil and unrighteous. And then one day, one of them died. Well, the brother wanted to have a stately funeral, and he wanted to make it very official, bring all his politician friends and everybody. But he had a problem, and so he went to a minister, and he said, hey, look, I know we, both of us, are not very good people. We lie, we're corrupt, blah, blah, and we cover up, and we manipulate. But hey, listen, I want to give you some money and ask you to speak. And please, all I ask you to do, and I'll give you a hefty sum, is to make sure that in your message, your sermon, you make reference to my brother as a saint. Well, the minister compromised, unfortunately, and it was like a who's who. Everybody packed in to hear it. And when the man finished the eulogy and the sermon, and the other brother was hanging out looking right behind the casket, the minister concluded, and he said, look, we know that this man was evil, vile, reprobate, was corrupt, immoral, all of these things. But I'll tell you this, compared to his brother, he was a saint. Now, that's a humorous, kind of goofy story, but people compromise and people propagandize. And today we have an incestuous relationship between the corrupt corporate media and the radicalized Democrat Party. Now, I want to talk to you about January 6th. Listen, you can take some notes if you want, but what did happen? Now, I was watching carefully. I had an assistant that was there that day watching. There was a gathering, as you know, about 700,000 people gathered there in D.C. I lived in D.C. 24 years, and what were they there for? Well, they were there because they were peacefully protesting and demonstrating, and that's exactly what it was. The fact that there were elements they believed of fraud. And the president spoke, and I want you to know 3 times that day he said clearly, peaceful protest, peacefully, patriotic, we're the party of law and order. You can go back and you can see what happened. But after his speech, a little bit after that, and there were 700,000 there, there was about 2,000 maybe that peeled off, and they went down to the Capitol. And what was taking place there? Well, that's where things got out of hand, and it was tragic. We know Romans 13 says that we're to be obedient to the governing authorities, and so it was despicable, and may it never happen again, and people are and have been held accountable. But that very day, President Trump, and it's legitimate to say that he delayed because he wasn't knowledgeable either. What's going on? Who's behind this? What's happening? Well, we saw what took place, and then shortly thereafter that, the president tweeted out about please remain peaceful, law and order, and then he told them eventually to go home. Now, what transpired, and these are the facts, listen to this. There were 2,000 probably that gathered around, and there was the rioting and the uprising, which the other party said was an insurrection. This was treason and all the rest of that. Well, you know what? These are the facts. There were 140 police officers that faced some type of assault, attack, punching, whatever it is. Unacceptable. And then there were 225 that were charged with assaulting, the police, the cops. There were then 640 charged with misdemeanors, mainly trespassing, etc. And there were a total of 85 that were charged, 85 charged with felonies out of, listen, 700,000 gathered that day. And some have been sentenced, some are still being held, a handful, and then most have been let go. Now, afterwards, You remember the headlines: insurrection, Trump incited it, impeachment, Facebook, Twitter, we've got to banish this man. Well, all of that was there. And then, of course, we had the barricades around the Capitol building there. And we had police and dogs. You thought you were in some third world country. What's going on? And boy, the opposition party, they exploited it to the max. Now, what took place on January the 6th of this year, after all of the investigation and everything, was an attempt to do what? Number one, distract from the abysmal record of the current man that's in the Oval Office. And that's what this is about. And number two, do everything possible to stop him from running again. So that's what's behind all of what's taken place. And now, what really was spoken of by Mr. Biden that day, and I heard it, he said that, for hours things were taking place. But you know what? It wasn't hours. It was 88 minutes of the rioting. He said that President Trump at that time rallied the mob to attack. That's a lie. That is absolutely untrue. He said 3 times, like I said, peacefully. Then Mr. Biden said these were armed insurrectionists. That's not true. There was not one person there rioting or protesting that had a gun. Nobody had an armed weapon. Now, some had like some chains, or some people had stiletto knives or whatever it was, but nobody had a gun. And then he went on to, explain other things about, the violence and all that. There was one person that was shot, unfortunately, and it was a tragedy. It was a lady. And of course, many said, why didn't the security officer simply give a warning shot? But one lady was shot. That's all, one lady. We don't minimize it, but that's the reality of this thing. And then Mr. Biden, in his speech on January 6th, he railed against the former president. And what was he after? Voter suppression, robbing people of their rights. What he's talking about is really the reform measures that have been put in place by state after state, especially with Republicans, so that we don't have these kind of fraudulent items and elements of fraud in elections anymore. Now, Mr. Biden spoke, and then he ended, and he said this. He said, the fabric of our nation is really at stake right now, but by the grace of God, he said, we're going to win. And he said, one nation, under God. And I listened to him. It was hard. And maybe you heard also Kamala Harris, the VP. What did she say that day? And maybe you heard this. She compared the events of that day with what? Pearl Harbor and 9/11. She actually referenced those dates. She said December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. And then she said September 11th, 2001. And she said those dates. And now this date will live basically in infamy. What? Do you know there were about 5,300 people that died in those first 2 events that I'm talking about? They were days of infamy. And so she made that kind of a comparison. You say, well, Larry, that's just politics. Yeah, it's politicizing something where people died and wars started. But this is for a reason. And Kamala was actually that day saying about how people came, and what were they doing? They were targeting the lives of what? The Congress people. Targeting, trying to kill them. Folks, this is exploitation, and it is evil. And I'd say it is so ugly. And Kamala, if you remember during the Black Lives Matter of George Floyd rioting, do you remember amidst $800 billion of damage and looting and setting a fire, police cars, a police station, people were killed, maimed, injured. It went on and on and on. Right in the midst of that, do you remember what Kamala did? Oh, she defended them. And she said, we need to raise money to help them get out of jail. Now, folks, I want to put on the screen for you what Donald Trump said that day in his response. And you got to look at this and be honest. What Donald Trump has every right as an American citizen, just like the 700,000 that gathered and people, millions all over the country, we have a right to our opinion to say we believe there were elements of fraud in the last election. Also, what was never stated and has never come out is the fact that the day before that event, Mr. Trump asked, and he had to do it, go through the proper channels, Pelosi and the mayor of D.C., that at least 10,000 National Guard be dispatched. they weren't dispatched. And the correspondence between Pelosi and the sergeant in arms and the leaders there, why was that covered up in this so-called investigation? They don't want this kind of stuff going out. And people had a right to demonstrate that day. And Mr. Trump called for peaceful. Did he delay? That's a matter of opinion. But I'll tell you right now, I want to put on the screen what Mr. Trump said. What was his statement concerning January the 6th? Read this. It'll be quiet, and read it and ponder what he said. I told you I would give you the truth, and we always do that on Week in Review. And you have to know, and please, you've got to communicate. Be a truth teller. Be an informed influencer. I'll tell you something that should have been raised, and again, was never raised. Do you know that Mark Zuckerberg in the last election gave $340 million to underwrite volunteer workers? They're called voter harvesters, who went into select strategic areas. And what did they do? They went door to door. They were paid, and they would help people fill out their ballots. And then we'll help you. We'll take it to the place. Now, you can't do anything like that at voting booths, at the polling places. But Mr. Zuckerberg got away with it. And so states have issued now laws to stop that and bring about reforms. I'm saying to you in this hour, we must pray, pray, pray for our country. We must ask God to have mercy on us, but you need to know the truth and communicate it so that not just you, but others that hear will be set free.